Now, for our first keynote at the Ash Carter Exchange, please join me in welcoming Dr. Eric Schmidt, Chair of the Special Competitive Studies Project, and our moderator, Dr. Graham Allison, Douglas Dillian Professor of Government at Harvard University, who will discuss the importance of innovation power.
So again, welcome. Wonderful tribute to our great colleague Ash, and I think set the terms and tone of what we're trying to do today. And we welcome Eric from, I think, London today. Eric, you basically framed the topic today. The topic of the session is innovation and national security. You wrote a piece last year in Foreign Affairs called Innovation Power, Why Technology Will Define the Future of Geopolitics. And one of your central claims in the article was, quote, the ability to innovate faster and better, the foundation on which military, economic, and cultural power now rests, will determine the outcome of the great power competition between the US and China. So, say more.
Well, first, thank everyone for coming. All of us miss Ash. And Ash and Graham influenced a great deal of my work, so thank you, Graham, as well. To answer your question, it's a fair statement that militaries and national security do not do innovation well at all. They're not organized around innovation the way, for example, tech companies are. They don't seize the moment, they don't invent new things, they don't replace old things. There are many reasons for this, but all of them, in my view, are unacceptable. And the reason is that the future structure of national security will be determined by who is the innovator in key technologies, including AI, quantum, autonomy, drones, etc. And you know, because you worked on it very hard, when we faced all this in your research in nuclear, the U.S. was ahead, but again, the competitors surged very quickly. We had all sorts of problems around the time. It's reasonable to say that these new tools will ultimately create a new balance of power, a new world order based on who are the leaders. The leaders will clearly include the United States and the UK on one side and China on another. And again, you're a genuine expert on China, you can speak about that. But the fact of the matter is China is a close follower and a great innovator on top of the stuff that's being invented for first in the West.
So to stay with that for a second, back, I think it was in 2020, you and I wrote a report from the Belfer Center on the great technology rivalry between the US and China. And you made the point in that piece that while the US has traditionally been the leader in the technology frontiers for most technologies, that actually China had surged in a way that actually if it was an Olympic race, was actually ahead of us in some arenas. We argued that the conventional wisdom that says China is only a near-peer competitor, which remains the language that the Office of Director of National Intelligence uses, was wrong, that we should think of it as a full peer competitor. So tell us a little bit about how you now see in various arenas the rivalry between the US and China.
Well, we did that work together, as you know, if you remember, 4 years ago. And it started with my annoyance at this habit of Americans denigrating what China is doing. China is not a near-peer competitor. China is a competitor. And in the 4 years since we published that, let's consider what they've achieved. When you buy a battery, when you buy a solar panel, and increasingly when you buy subassemblies of things, if you buy anything involving semiconductors, you are using Chinese components to some degree. They dominate those fields. And indeed, their current domestic problems, which are certainly very hard and certainly non-trivial, and I think are undervalued and misunderstood by Americans, they're still overweighting their industrial policy areas, which include transportation, electric vehicles of one kind or another, battery, the tools and technologies for industrialization. It's going to be extremely hard for the West to catch up with China in the areas that they dominate. And again, you've written a great deal about this. An ideal scenario would be one of competitive advantage, where America uses Chinese components to build things that are great, and China uses American components to do things that are great. That's called the law of competitive advantage. It's very difficult to see how, even with very large amounts of money, we can take the advantage that China has in raw materials, in semiconductor packaging, I'm not talking about semiconductor, but packaging at scale, and certainly the entire value chains around batteries, electronic vehicles, and so forth. Those are won, and they've been won by China. It's very hard to catch up. We argued in the article, and I want to say again, that a simple rule in tech businesses is that if you have a strong leader, it's very hard to catch up with them. That may not be true in other industries, but during the time you're busy catching up, the strong leader gets stronger. They're not sitting there, so forth. So you have incredible national champions in the West, good examples being ASML and TSMC in Taiwan, but you also have national champions in China. And although we are busy trying to ban it in the United States, TikTok is the #1 app in the United States, and last time I checked, most of the development occurs in China. Who would have thought?
So again, Eric, I think you've been one of the clearest and clarion voices about realism and being clear-eyed about where China stands in various races. And I think a lot of Americans still remain in denial because that's our natural birthright. We've been accustomed to this. This is the way it ought to be. And then we talk down China in this area or that area. And as you rightly say, they have many challenges. If we take the AI component, which you've both led in building Google, fortunately, I think when you were chief executive, you brought up about half of the talent in the world in the AI space. And the reason why the US has been in the lead in the AI innovation and development, I think, is because of this, the private companies like Google and Microsoft and the others that have been in the frontier. But in the AI space now with China, you've been also looking at their applications and the ways in which they, as it earlier had basically dominated facial recognition, voice recognition, even fintech. So tell us a little bit about the more granular race in the AI space as you see it, both in the advance of AI and in the applications.
So, so there's a distinction between like ChatGPT. Google has a very good model called Gemini 1.5. There's a new one coming out shortly. I've heard. You have Anthropic with Claude 3, again doing amazing things. You have, surprisingly to me, Meta has turned out to be a great leader in this space, and they're releasing open source models, which are very powerful. And of course, you have Elon's AI with this enormous data center that he's building in Memphis. And he looks like he's going to be a very significant player as well. All of these are US-led initiatives that have various proliferation issues. One of the things to know is that most of the Chinese people start with open source, and in particular, they start with now Llama 3, 400 billion model, which interestingly does not have very good Chinese language support. In fact, it has essentially none. So virtually all of the Chinese companies start by taking one or more of the open source versions, what I just told, and then they essentially fine-tune, improve, modify, whatever term you wish, to make them much better. There are at least 2 or 3 serious competitors to the US. One is called DeepSeek in China, another one is called 0.1. That's a strange name. There are significant efforts under ByteDance in Singapore and also in Alibaba in Malaysia to build extremely large AGR farms. There's evidence that the Chinese who have been subjected to very strict export restrictions by what I view as very good policies from the Trump and Biden administration. There's lots of evidence that they have found ways around those restrictions, and in particular, they are doing training outside of China, which is generally legal. They're also importing into China wafers that have the subcomponents necessary, which they claim are legal. It's not clear to me. There are plenty of examples of illegal remarketing of the chips, which violate the sanctions, and ultimately somebody will figure them out after it's already happened, so the damage has already been done. So China has prioritized AI to the same degree that they prioritize things like solar batteries, electric cars, and so forth. My take on it, having talked to all the players, is they're not going to dominate foundation models. They're going to try to dominate the app space. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One is that the Chinese are not particularly excited about free. They like businesses. They're all entrepreneurial. And second, their funding universe is tougher, so they have to show revenue sooner, which means that they're going to have to build applications that can get revenue fairly quickly. And they're working on all the obvious areas. So I think one way to say it is the race is on. They're slightly behind, but not a lot, maybe a year or two. Depends on who you talk. The real question now is, do they build apps that are amazing on top of this platform, or are they built in the West? And we don't know.
Okay, and the TikTok example is an interesting one to try to reflect on, because obviously TikTok is not copying something, since it's nothing to copy. In the fintech space, Ant earlier was another example of what looked to be an extremely disruptive financial app, which got then caught up in other problems in China. So if you're, again, thinking back, you're running Google and looking at the advantages and disadvantages of focusing on the advances in the foundation models and thinking about the applications, do give us some more reflections.
Well, I think it's important to remember that the industry gets caught up in platform technologies, which is sort of what I've done for my whole career, and we love them, and we're all scientists, and they matter a lot. The average person doesn't really care. The average person just wants the thing to work. And so the rise of phone apps for Android and iOS that are really powerful is a relatively recent fact. It's driven basically by the smartphone platform revolution. So to me, the question is, what are the apps that will emerge on a phone from either China or the US that will make your life better? I'll give you two simple ones. I would like to see a teacher's assistant, think of it as an AI teacher, that for every student in the world can educate that student on any subject they care about in their natural language on their phone. Now, why does that product not exist? The underlying platform is multimodal. It can take any format and it can speak in any language. Gemini 1.5 now can do 200 more languages. I mean, these are extraordinary achievements. So where's the app on top of that, which is a relatively simple app, if the underpinning is so strong to do teaching? Another example, an AI doctor. Most people in the world have healthcare from nurse practitioners or the local, half-trained medical professional. They don't have the kind of integrated health systems that we in the United States have. And why is there not an app that does the same thing? Again, multimodal, so forth. If you think about it, there's so many examples where generative AI, in one form or another, can provide entertainment, education, and so forth. My sense is those companies are getting founded, but they're getting founded slow and late. But that's ultimately when these platforms happen. There's some huge use of any platforms. It's unexpected. My favorite example is Uber. I was obviously heavily involved with the launch of the iPhone. I was on stage with Steve, and I also did the launch myself of Android. And I just at the time didn't see that someone like Travis and his co-founder would figure out that using GPS on a phone, you could do, shared services and basically two-sided markets. That was a real invention. So what's the real invention in terms of powerful AI. We know, for example, that powerful AI can highly target you as an individual. So we know, for example, that there will be an app which is essentially the personal assistant. So Graham will have a personal assistant, I will have a personal assistant, but this personal assistant will be a polymath. This is not a, hey, what should I do today? This is a scientist, engineer, artist, musician of a level that's close to the best of human ability that's available to me. When that app is available, and a normal person who's just trying to get through the day has as his or her friend and assistant someone who's at the level of intelligence and achievement of Leonardo da Vinci, that's a whole new world. Indeed, Graham, as you know, Dr. Kissinger and I and Craig Mundy wrote a second version of our AI book, which talks a lot about polymaths and their impact in living with them. St. Andrew is a historian, as you know. And that book comes out in a few weeks on the anniversary of his death at 100 years old.
So actually, for the advertising here, I just happened to bring a copy of this book. If you haven't got it, you should order it quickly. It's called modestly Genesis, which is quite interesting. And Henry and Craig and Eric worked on this for a couple of years, the last couple of years of Henry's life. It's an extraordinary book in that it goes, I mean, if you want to stretch your mind in 7 different directions, Eric has just begun to stretch your mind about the possibility of having a personal AI that could do this. This goes off even further, exploring what this may mean for actually, as Henry would put it, the Enlightenment and thinking and our presumption that human beings are the highest form of intelligent life. And so it even becomes a little, maybe more than a little scary. So Eric, you're going to be back here in Cambridge on November 18 for a forum event on the book. So give us a few teasers from the book.
Well, look, first place, and thank you for organizing the event in Boston for me. What we talk about in the book is what happens to society when you have these kinds of intelligences floating around. And we talk a lot about what does it mean to be human. Henry, when he wrote his undergraduate thesis, which was basically none of us were alive then, wrote about Kant, and he wrote about the relationship of Kant and history and self-perception. And so in his entire life, he was always very interested in how does people perceive reality. He himself was a realist, as we know, but how do they make decisions and so forth? And he believes that AI, in its broad form, will change the way we perceive society, will change the way we think, in mostly good ways, but not in all good ways. And we have plenty of examples of how this works. But I think the simplest answer is we're not ready. We are not ready as a society for what's going to come on. When I'm in Silicon Valley and in Cambridge, it feels to me like you guys in Cambridge and Silicon Valley are essentially, it's everything, everywhere, all at once. You're changing every assumption, right? You already changed democracy as an election because of social media and misinformation. But this notion of scalable networks, getting people connected and building solutions changes the way we work together and live together. It has enormous impacts on our children, on human relationships. So for example, a simple example would be in their early 20s, many of the students in your universities are highly anxious. Many people believe that that anxiety comes from the overuse of phones, social media, approvals, and so forth. It's difficult for teenage girls, but it's also difficult for teenage boys. There's plenty of examples of the system, the social systems that we built, where you get somebody who's unhappy, and because the reinforcement learning systems basically keep feeding them information that's what they want, they get more and more depressed. So if you say to the system, hey, I'm depressed, the system says, you're right, you should be depressed, and here's why you should be depressed, and that makes the system, the person to be more depressed. There are plenty of examples of people who ultimately committed suicide, which is horrible, because they got augured into these systems. So those are simple examples of some of the points that we make in the book.
Okay, so hold your breath for November 18, but I would say order the book in the meantime. I think it comes out shortly. Eric, let me switch topics closer to the agenda today as we think about the ways in which this innovations in technology are impacting national security. So you're unique in many dimensions, one of which is somebody who comes from the frontiers of actually innovation in the most important technologies, but who then, thanks to your own interest and ASH's persuading you to become the chair of the Defense Innovation Board back in 2016, have struggled with the beast, as I think Ash would sometimes call it, namely this five-sided building and the culture of a defense department and of a military and of indeed a defense industrial base that have been accustomed to being number one unchallenged and to doing things our own way and on our own timetable. I remember, I think probably it was the first year you were the head of the Defense Industrial Board, you had spent some time in the Pentagon and you were trying to explain to people the difference between the timeline of a development of a new product at Google and the 16 years from the dream in the eye to something coming off a runway or out of a shipyard. And how if somebody came to you at Google and said, I have a plan for a product that's going to produce, we're going to roll out in 16 years, you would dismiss them and move on to somebody else that's going to do it in 16 days or 16 weeks. So tell us a little bit more about how you now see the struggle of the defense establishment and our national security establishment as it deals with these necessities for more rapid innovation.
Well, as you know, we talked about it, I spent quite a bit of time studying the war in Ukraine. And Ash convinced me to get involved in this. I have no background whatsoever, so I owe him a great debt, as many people in the audience do. And when we did, and he took me around, he was just incredibly gracious and educated me. We did a series of war games, and the war games in the Pentagon are essentially static. That's not how war really works. Real war, the innovation is so intense that it just defies anything. It's so much more intensive than even my work. His lives are at stake, people are moving very, very quickly. So, a cynical way of saying it is that thank goodness we're at peace. But if we were at war, Pentagon would behave very, very differently. And so in that sense, you can think of these things as there's no particular hurry to change the incumbencies. There are many mouths to feed. There are many important missions that people are working on. They're just not the right ones. And so when you have a systematic technology change, such as autonomy in drones, which is what I've been working on, you just have this very, very long delay between what is obvious to most people and how it gets implemented. There's some good news, and the good news is that there's now a relatively large number of software and hardware companies in the United States and in Europe who are building the right products. And the Pentagon is beginning to learn how to purchase them. There's a project called Replicator, for example. One of the concerns that I have, and I want to be very blunt here, is that the vast majority of weapons that the U.S. is giving to Ukraine don't work very well because of the Russian jamming, the Russian electronic warfare, and other logistical issues. And if I shipped you a product in a commercial business and it didn't work, you would immediately yell at me. If you paid for it and it didn't work, I would immediately start working on fixing it. But because we're at peace, which is a good thing, that cycle is very slow, if not at all, right, because of the 16 years phenomenon. I can give you plenty of examples. The modern jets that we use in our military have chips that control them. The jets are very, very powerful. The chips are from 20 years ago, 15 years ago. How is that okay? Why? You would never use a computer either in your office or your home that was 15 years ago. You would have upgraded it for obvious reasons, and the power is so much better. It's stuff like that, and it's pervasive in the system. So whether it's a chip in a jet, which is not highly expensive, a jet is, a chip's not, to an aircraft carrier, this whole attitude has to change. The future of naval war cleared the Black Sea, pretty amazing. If you look at the future of land war, it's going to be drone against drone. And all those tanks that the U.S. likes to build, you don't really need them. You don't really need the artillery. You certainly don't need the mortars. You need precision drones. And those drones are far deadlier, and they're also much less expensive. So they're cheaper, better, and faster, which is precisely not how the Pentagon operates.
So again, to push you a little further, because this is one that you and Ash and I talked about a number of times. So let's imagine I accept your diagnosis, which I do, and now I'm trying to think, okay, so in the absence of a war that forces me to change completely, what to do, or how to do. So any thoughts about, because I think it's relevant for the rest of the discussion today, how we actually become more innovative and adaptive and more rapidly as the whole national security establishment, but in particular in the department.
So a simple analysis of the department is it has too many bosses. So there are two different groups in Congress that regulate them. One is called the Armed Services Committees, and then there's an appropriator committees. And the people in the audience who've done this know the madness of having a part of the Senate and the House that actually makes the decision, and then you have another step where most of the money is taken away. There are plenty of stories where smart people have gotten it through the Armed Services Committee. It's in legislation and the money gets collected because it's seen as not appropriate. There's a set of core issues. One is that the Pentagon is organized around large-scale procurement of hard, expensive things. It does a very bad job of procuring software, and it doesn't work very well with small companies. So one way to do this is to do what Ash tried to do, which is basically to have funding of those companies and then special small groups that do it. An alternative model, which has not yet been tested, is actually compete them. So in other words, let's say for purposes of argument that you have a group that is trying to build weapons to defend Taiwan in the traditional way, then you probably should have another group which is trying to build weapons that defends Taiwan in a non-traditional way, as it's code for drones. And you solve the various drone problems, and then you have a contest. Because that's in fact how it works. Now, people are nervous to do this because it pisses people off, it annoys people, but we have a competitiveness problem in the U.S. military. I'm not suggesting they're not very powerful, they are, but they're using traditional mechanisms. Another example is that there's a future jet, so-called sixth-generation fighters, and the current development approach is to have them be both manned and unmanned. Now, these fighters will be used for 50 years, roughly. So think of it as 2070, 2080. Do you really believe that in 2070 you're going to have a human in a jet dropping a bomb and in dogfights? The last dogfights were in the 1970s. This is not going to happen. So just stop. And instead, try to build autonomous drone systems in the Air Force to do the same thing that can get through persistent jamming and other threats. It's a new set of war. And I'm sorry that the Air Force is full of brilliant and talented pilots. They will be on the ground. It is safer that our brilliant and technical pilots, talented pilots are on the ground and not in the air. Where we celebrate the Tom Cruise dogfighter, that's a terrible idea. Let the computers fight, and you're sitting at home in command drinking coffee.
Okay, no, I would say that's blunt enough to get us started, to get our juices flowing. What a fantastic opportunity to have somebody that's actually been so much of the competitive frontiers of technology on the one hand, and is now seized of our national security issues. So it's a great pleasure to have you here today. I wish you were here in person. I look forward to here on the 18th, so let's say thank you very much to Eric.